something that influenced Elaine back in the day, because
Yes.
it was a, this is to me a huge part of Massachusetts history, and it's,
Probably because as we pack through her stuff and go through it, she's like, my pottery, put it aside. So we do.
I'd like to know who she is.
She's about 63.
65.
I wonder where she went to school for it.
She lived in, I don't know where she did. We'll see her this weekend.
We'll find out.
It'll be interesting.
She's, yeah, very sweet lady. Not sure how she started.
Well, this is a program called the Librarian and the Saturday Evening Girls. It's a pottery program, and I will be making the pots on the wheel, but it's a section of Massachusetts history that basically has dropped off the face of the earth for a while. Several years ago, a librarian from Stoughton asked me to put together a program because of a recent publication of a book called The Saturday Evening Girls, which was a fictionalized account of this enterprise that had occurred in Boston. This was something that was done to improve the lives of immigrant community in Boston. Italian and the Jewish girls were the ones who attended this, which developed from an earlier reading room library that was established in what was called the North Bennett Street School, which Bennett Street School still exists today. You can go and learn a whole bunch of trades there. It was established by a group of philanthropic women, including Helen Storrow, Storeton Village and Storrow Drive in Boston, named after her husband, probably more so than her, but she was the one that was the driving force behind this. The reading room for the boys, for the community in the North End, evolved into a reading room for girls, where they would collectively get together and learn storytelling and other things, including civics and politeness and other things that they decided to be sort of the norms of the day. And that evolved into, from 4th grade to 12th grade, the girls would be meeting one night a week. These girls would meet on Saturday night, so they were called the Saturday Evening Girls. And Edith Guerriere was brought in as a librarian to help these girls understand and to learn. And Edith had met another Edith, an Edith Brown, at the Boston Museum of Art, and the two of them began looking at this library in Boston and thinking how it could work to improve the lives of these girls even more so. The girls were working as well as attending the Saturday evening class. They were given the opportunity to go to West Gloucester to a camp, but when they would go to West Gloucester, they would lose their pay. So they had to find a way of generating an income for the girls so they could take a week off from work and not lose the pay. So the girls, the two Ediths, while they were in Switzerland, fell in love with a particular style of pottery. And when they returned in 1906 to Boston, they presented the idea to Helen Storrow that the girls could make pottery and they could sell it. And initially the stuff was called Saturday Evening Girls, S-E-G is how it would be marked. And Edith Brown was the artistic one who could throw. And I'll get into where when I'm on the wheel, I'll be demonstrating. I'll get more into the particulars about it. And from this point, they evolved into children's pottery and highly decorated pottery, some of it being plain like this, although having a Swiss origin, certainly evolving into some Greek forms as well that you find there. Their patterns, some could have been original, but I brought some 1920s magazines that show that the designs are also quite available at the time as well, and mimic especially what you see whether you're saying it's this style or that style, they're all roughly the same, and they shared into the experience. Everything came together and shared into the experience of making this pottery for the girls. The techniques were generally individual. Edith would throw the pots, the girls would decorate, and the stuff would be sold eventually in Brighton at a place called the Paul Revere well, initially it was called Paul Revere because the school was around the corner or in the general area of the North End Church in Boston where Paul Revere hung the lanterns. And you could see there was some girls specialized in decorating. This girl here is involved with glazing the pots in a large crock, pickling crock. At one point they had 200 girls working for them. Over the course of about 20 years, the place basically was just a sieve for pumping money into. It never was profitable, even though they sold at Macy's and Marshall. Was
Jordan Marsh.
No, Jordan Marsh, Marshall Fields. It's funny how close they can be. Marshall Fields, but they never really made a profit. So Helen retired from the place in the 1930s, and by 1943 the place was out of business. What was fairly reasonably priced utilitarian pottery eventually will go for thousands of dollars today. If you find, especially if it's got the SEG mark, especially the early pieces like this. They learned by going to, Edith Brown learned by going to a Charlestown pottery that was operating, was just making simple stoneware like this. They were taught by a Swedish immigrant how to throw. And at the Merrimack pottery, an English immigrant taught them how to make glazes. So this really is a whole melting pot of people whose whose experiences brought them together, their knowledge brought them together to the benefit of somewhat the Boston community, but there's other things that will play into it. If you look here, I brought this photo here. Over here are the kilns of this pottery shop in Boston Harbor, just sticking up. I wanted you to understand the scale of a big factory versus this is the type of kiln that they had at Paul Revere Pottery, a completely different thing. This also, I'm going to just make light mention of this. This plate here is a Civil War plate, should say one nation, one flag. One was just excavated down in the in a privy, unfortunately, in Philadelphia. And the purpose of me bringing that, and now I'll get to the wheel, is the fact that her father was a second lieutenant in the Civil War for the black Union armies in Massachusetts. He served in both Union armies as a second lieutenant. So this is going to have some importance when I start talking about him and the way he came back. This piece here is called bisqued. This is a step in the process. I'll be explaining that a little bit more on the wheel. But you can see that the pattern was pressed into the clay. A lot of these patterns here would be traced over with tissue paper and then transferred onto the pots. I brought a liquid glaze here also to give you an idea, sort of a yogurt consistency. In this case here, the glaze would have been painted on the different colors onto the pieces, especially like you see here. These are both impressed. So this would have been filled in with a black liner, for instance, and then filled in with the white. So the pots are, there's a difference in the kilns. There's going to be a difference in firing technique. This is an applied glaze. This is a salt glaze. So the two ediths certainly were experiencing also a change in what was happening to the American potter at the time. In Massachusetts history, we used to do local red clay, coated with a lead glaze, perhaps with a slip decoration on it. Then we started importing clay up from Long Island and Philadelphia, and we start throwing salt into the kiln, and we do slip decoration colored with blue, and we do that for a while, and then glassware comes in and completely screws everything up for the potter, because everybody's buying glass, and there's enough British cheap pottery coming over, and that eats up the tableware, so glassware is going to eat us up. So a lot of the red clay potters either go out of business, or you're going to find they're starting to make out of red clay art pottery. So these women here carry on with the Chelsea and the Merrimack and the other styles of pottery, and try to develop their own style and marketing for it in a time where there's just so much other stuff on the market that it's very difficult to try to get an anchor in it. There's also stuff being shipped in from the Midwest or on the trains. Once you get the trains shipping stuff in from Ohio, then we're all, as potters, are basically in trouble, because the factories are just cranking out huge amounts of molded stuff. So we got yellowwares and stonewares and earthenwares and chinas. So I'll be reproducing some of these pots that you find on the wheel here. We'll get to the wheel now. Any questions about anything here? I invite you to look a little more closely. This is the original studio where they were at. They also produce doll heads, and I talked to an expert doll collector, and what happened was they started producing doll heads in World War I, and when the war came, they just couldn't sell them. They were supposed to go off to Germany and be components, I guess, to other dolls. But at that time, Germany was producing the doll heads, and that's all this collector knew about was the German heads. Well, apparently after World War I guess in the 1930s, whoever was taking care of these, when they emptied the shop, they threw them into the river out there. So these little doll heads were floating up for a while, like in the 1940s and 50s in the river, being found on the side. Wow. So they, again, it's an unpredictable business. It's a very difficult business, which we're involved with. But they started off here. They went to move into a bigger location in Brighton. I'll get into that in a little bit. But basically, the neighbors didn't want them there. They tried to zone them out. I'll talk a little bit more about that. Any questions? Okay, we'll get on the wheel. Is shaping the clay, glazing the pots somehow, and firing them. So you do need a kiln. You do need some shaping mechanisms. Not necessarily having to be a potter's wheel. It can certainly be another instrument. It can be a mold. It can be shaping by coils. But the techniques of shaping the clay are always pressure and motion. And that basically typifies the whole experience of Edith Brown and Edith Guerriere as well. They're always confronted by having to shape something new to improve or shape the girls' lives that they were working with in Boston. But this is a coil pot, and the technique that I'll be using on the wheel is still the same thing. It's pressure and motion. I do this for every program because when I get on the wheel, it's not going to make any sense what I'm doing. And I would just want to illustrate the fact that this is a technique that is pressure and motion. I'm doing the same thing I'm going to do once I start throwing, which is applying pressure and moving something, whether it's the pressure tool, whether it's the clay, whether it's my hands. So this will be a slab pot. And once on the potter's wheel, I'll do the same thing as making this pinch pot, which again is pressure and motion.
Where is this clay coming from?
Specifically, or do you mean in general?
Well, this particular clay you're using now, where?
Well, okay, I blend my own clays today. Commercial sources today are, the industry is requiring that they have an extensive, non-exhaustible or almost non-exhaustible source, which they do exhaust after a while. So we're stuck at the realm of what the industry wants to supply us today, and they're not supplying us. Clay goes into, I have a container of white clay, I have a ball of white clay here. White clay today goes into paper, goes into paint. They don't care about potters. Goes into tile making, goes into the rubber tires. More clay in your tires, the harder your tires will be. So for instance, I can buy white clay, but they don't care about me. I have to buy what they produce. So the white clay sources are down in the Carolinas and Georgia, moving up towards Pennsylvania. Georgia's got this red clay, which is an extensive source that's been dug now for at least 80 years. Part of my clay blend here is another clay that's been dug now. It's called Roseville, and it's been dug since the 1870s. And I mean, basically, you're looking at strip mining just like, that's what they want to do, just like with coal mining. They just level out whole areas, and they can go down 150, 200 feet. Massachusetts, you got several clay pits down here in Southbridge, but they're acreage. They will exhaust themselves producing a few 100,000 or maybe 1 million bricks. There was one down here, Brown, just in back of the library. There was one up on Alpine Drive. There was, Sturbridge had no brick yards. East Brimfield had a brick yard, but they're small. They just are not going to last. They're going to exhaust themselves. And that's where, basically where Massachusetts gets the problem. They use up their clay very quickly. The most famous clay pit that was exhausted is probably Breeds Hill or Bunker Hill. Well, it's Bunker Hill. Surrounding Charlestown was all clay. And those drumlins of clay that were out there, one of them was removed, and by making bricks, and we were producing hundreds of thousands of bricks in the 17th and 18th century, shipping bricks from Nova Scotia down to the Caribbean. 250-acre clay pits in Somerville, and in Medford and in Charlestown, but nothing like what you're going to find with the red clay down in Georgia, or in Indiana, the white clays, just huge extensive sources. So I blend my clay. I actually tried purchasing local clay from the Brookfields, but nobody's harvesting it.
So they're just leaving it in the ground?
Yeah,
It's not profitable for them.
that's what it is.
It's a pity.
My clay mixer, the clay mixer at Sheffield, Mass. Mixes 10 ton an hour, and that's nothing. That's a small mixer compared to the big industry. But on the other hand, like I said, it's not profitable if you want to sell to a potter. You got to be selling to, in Canaan, Connecticut, there was a yard. They don't produce it anymore. It's a white clay pit, went to the pharmaceutical industry. Goes into vitamins, goes into makeup. And even though they still have white clay, it's just not profitable for them to produce anymore. Because there are bigger, more expansive clay pits. A lot of them up in northern North Canada and Brazil, and in Brazil they were getting exploited quite badly. Multinational corporations owned the big clay pits. They used to be father and son things about 40 years ago. Now it's not. Paper's a big industry. When you take a stack of magazines and put it next to an equal height of newspaper and pick up the magazines, you're feeling the clay weight in the paper. So the shaping that Edith did, well, actually I should back up. Edith Brown at the Saturday Evening Girls Pottery was using a Massachusetts red clay. And being that she was in Brighton, Cambridge East Cambridge had clays. I have not located where they were obtaining their clay. Danvers was a big clay pit. Peabody's a big clay pit, going back into the colonial period. Medford, Charlestown, West Sterling was called Pottersville. Somerset, Mass was called Pottersville. There was a town in western Massachusetts called Claytown as well. So she certainly could have been buying her clay locally. In order for her to learn, as I mentioned, she searched out a potter to teach her, and that probably was in Charlestown at Edmonds Pottery. Charlestown was a redware pottery town in the colonial period, but very early on in the 1700s, they also became a stoneware town, importing clay from Philadelphia. And when they started that adventure in the 17 teens, it was done by Isaac and Grace Parker. And they were able to get Massachusetts to give them a loan funded through the lottery. They awarded them a monopoly on pottery making for a 30-year period. But the stress was so great, her husband died after 5 weeks. So Charlestown, the Ediths learned how to throw, but Charlestown is also where you have a woman running a pottery shop in Boston. So there's always been a role for women in pottery making. I always start off with this one. Whether you're talking about the Ediths being created for creating pottery, it's always madness, I should say, because you limit yourself in observing one particular thing. And with pottery or being creative and doing a school like they did or a library, it's a matter of taking what you know and morphing it into something else, which is what they had to do, and being inspired to. So creativity, pressure and motion, which is how I'm shaping, and trying to get the confidence up to do something right. Certainly the impetus for both Ediths. So this initially would be what's called a jack bottle, which would be a leather bottle in the 17th century for carrying drink. But a potter in the 18th century decided to go one step further. There. And combining a coil, a pinch, a throne, and a slab pot together. Now, Edith Guerriere, or Guerriere's, Guerriere, his father was an English immigrant who served in the Civil War, second lieutenant for the Black Armies in Massachusetts. Came back from the Civil War, homeless, no place to live, no income, and a Quaker in New Bedford announced that the men could come and live on his land. And what happened after that was, actually I should back up. This man's, the Quaker was friends with Thoreau and Emerson, and Alcott communicated with him through letters. Very educated man, very philosophical man. You have all the friends in the world, but doesn't mean that you don't necessarily do the right thing at the right time. When he left the house one day, his wife went to his daughter and said, "If you're going to marry that man who just arrived, who the man, Mr. Gear, you're going to have to do it today. Your father's gone away. You got to leave now." So that's what happened. The two of them ran off and got married, and no dowry was paid, unfortunately. So they suffered income-wise for quite a while. The father did not accept the marriage, but in a few years, they had a daughter, Edith, and when Edith was 7, her mother passed away, and her father went from job to job, which when you read her diary, it's curious because one author said he went from job to job, but the guy was he was putting his girl through school. So he bought a house and then he sold it for a profit and sent her off to Mount Hermon. She just kept going to one better school and another better school, and she just learned and learned and learned, and her father was living in one room, real bad housing according to her description. At one point they tried to open a lumber business out west, but he failed at that, so they came back to New England. It was at the times in the summer when she wasn't going to school that she was staying with her relatives on her mother's side, that she also got back into meeting or discussing the Alcotts and the Thoreaus and being impressed with those thoughts as well, transcendentalists and such. And it impressed on her, I think, very much a global attitude on who we are as a people. Helen Storer recognized her because for her talents and brought her in as a librarian at the reading room. And I think she probably was jammed up at that point trying to figure out how to make things work. For her girls. They were all living in squalid conditions in Boston. You had the Italian community and the Jewish community. And she does mention some racial tension initially, but that all went away because they all realized they were learning together. But of course, that didn't, as I mentioned before, when they went off to move the studio to Brighton, that didn't stop the neighbors and people in that neighborhood from trying to keep them out because the kilns were stinky or some other attitude that they possessed. I wonder what the Swedish potter thought of having Edith Brown come in and say, "I want you to teach me how to throw." Because it wasn't something that woman did a lot of in one hand. I'm sure it certainly was a male-dominated trade. But we do have in the art pottery movement some great figureheads in the 1870s and 80s. Quite a number. Newcomb pottery, and ropewood pottery, being run by a woman. Apparently he had some respect for it. The I'd like to know how hard it was for them to find a teacher, though. They had what was called the two Ediths had what was called a Boston marriage. So they were accepted in the circles, philanthropic circles, for what they were accomplishing. But nonetheless, even the girls from the inside Boston were still remarked upon how, I guess there was an attitude with some of the donors coming in, making them feel embarrassed at the time about what they were doing. But no matter how embarrassed they were, 50% of the granddaughters of these girls attended college, which would have been probably around the 1950s or 60s, which I think is pretty good. So this is a classic shape of the pottery. But what it's not obvious is that this is a cylinder. When Edith Brown was taught the wheel, she would have been taught that there are only 3 forms that one needs to learn. Cylinder is going to be the first one. Here. Second form would be the bowl. Let's see. Now in the Charlestown shop, the Edmund shop, generally a production potter needs to use up around 1,000 pounds of clay a day. It's about the size of a crate that you would use to ship a water heater. I don't know if Edith was producing that. I wish there was that record of telling how much pottery she would throw in a day. This is about a 2-pound piece of clay. So my production would be 500 of these. At their first location, they had the kilns in the basement. There we go. Second location, they had so much business, they hired a kiln man from one of the pottery shops that probably went out of business in the Boston area. Could have been Chelsea, could have been Lowe, could have been even Edmonds. And he was hired to fire the pottery. He had another guy. And it was remarked that actually there were the two guys worked together, but one night somebody showed up. It was the other workman. He showed up and he robbed the place. That was one of the devastating stories that she had mentioned in her diary. This goes like this now. There we go. I think it's a little pedestal over there from the illustration. So that's the second shape, bowls. And everything comes off the wheel soft. So it's all very gelatin-like, very flexible. Third piece would be the plate. So we'll do a quick plate, show you how that's done. Any questions at this point?
How long would it take to fire those?
Doesn't work like that necessarily. The complication in firing a kiln, well, there's two things that happens, but they're all based on the same thing. You always fire for the heaviest pot or the widest pot. The widest pot, because if the heat's only going to the rim of the piece, before an equal amount of heat is in the center of the plate or the platter, the rim is going to expand on it, and the center is going to be cold, and you're going to get a nasty crack. So you have to allow for that heat to permeate into the center of the plate. But if you're throwing crocks, pickling crocks, you know, that have an inch wall, the rest of the load can be little tiny pitchers, but if you're firing for the little tiny pitchers, you're going to blow up that crock. There is a water in the clay that I add to make it plastic. There is a water in the clay that remains from the humidity in the air being absorbed by the clay that will not be removed until 600 degrees. So if you're firing bricks, of course, you're going to be taking a lot longer to dehydrate those those bricks, than if you are firing pottery. So the firing rate's going to be affected. I can fire a kiln load of these in my electric kiln in about 6 hours to 1900 degrees. And a kiln load of those would be, I'd say around 36 to 40 of them. So that's 6 hours. Same load going into the 21-foot tall kiln that I used to fire at Old Sturbridge Village. Got 600 of these babies in there. I'm firing 12 hours for 600. So, you know, it's, and then 20 hours to cool. So it's the same, it's relative to the type of kiln too. I can't fire it faster than 6 hours, or I'm taking a chance of blowing them up, but I certainly can increase the number. And then, God, there are some kilns, I've read of guys firing kilns for 4 days. Brick kilns can take, in Taunton, they were producing 1 million brick kiln firings. And it takes 4 months to heat, 6 months to cool. Versus I could have these out in 12 hours in the kiln. And 12 hours at Old Sturbridge Village. Old Sturbridge, at that kiln, I can get 600 out in 12 hours. My kiln, 35. I have to do 20 firings in order to get the same amount of product done. Takes me longer, I guess, in my little kiln. There. So now we'll do the plate. Pressure and motion. So this is technically called greenware because it's not fired. None of the product has gone into the kiln, so none of it's been forced to change into a glass, an opaque glass, which is what the firing will do. Firing isn't hardening the clay, it's melting the clay. I had mentioned the Grace Parker shop earlier, and when the big dig occurred in Boston, they dug up the area where the Parker pottery shop was located. So this chamber pot from 1720s suffered because it was close to the heat. This is what happens with clay when you're heating it up. It begins to melt into a glass, an opaque glass, which you have to pay attention to. You heat it up so it's red, it will glow orange. Once it starts to glow orange with the red clays, you cool it down. With the stonewares, you bring it up into yellow heat or white heat, and then perhaps you're successful with the firing, and it will retain its form, and it'll be extremely dense, very stone-like. This is called an earthenware, the red clay pottery, or even white clay, because it's more prone to chipping, and yet that chipping allows it to be used as a cookware. because the porosity of the clay's got all these minute cracks, and it allows it to take the heat better. So stoneware is too hard for cooking in. Earthenware is, historically speaking, and earthenware is very suitable for cooking in. So they're practical for different purposes. So potters need to know the color of the heat in the kiln and how quickly or how slowly to obtain that heat, and how quickly or slowly to cool it down. So in some shops, like I said, with their shop, they had a guy just firing the kiln. He wasn't involved in the production. And the photographs there also show the girls at different steps in the process. Certainly somebody taking the plates and bringing them aside, for instance, and letting them dry to a point where they could be impressed with the pattern in a state where it is flexible like a piece of cheese. They could begin decorating it. Or stiffer, like a piece of thick sole leather, which most of us don't know anymore. Leather hard, where they could barely press into the clay with the pattern, just like I had done with the pot that looks like this over there. I'm going to cut this again because clay's got a sense of humor, and in that little bit of time that I continued talking, it probably stuck itself back down. So, and then we can pick it up. And it's just a horrible thing to pick up. There we go. There we go. They also made tiles too, which really are not too much fun. When you have a flat item like this laying down on a surface, there's only one drying area. The base is never going to dry at the same rate as the top. So tiles and plates require a lot of flipping till you are able to get them to the state that you want. Otherwise, the rim is drying, and as the water is removed, the piece is shrinking, which means that this will cup up on you very easily. You'll see tiles starting to cup up on you. So then you flip them upside down, and hopefully it straightens them out. Even with a 1.5-inch brick, you still flip them. And if you look at the old bricks, the old handmade bricks, you'll see fingerprints sometimes in the bricks as well, because of them being flipped. Yep?
How do they make the tiles in England then? I think they're the ones with the slip of a different.
There's several different ways of decorating tiles. One way England's got a short history. Tile making.
The French ones.
The French ones, the Roman ones, and the French ones. You're using a form for stamping into the clay. So you got an impression in the clay, perhaps a fleur-de-lis pattern, and then the depressions would be filled with the white clay to offset the red clay, and that would be a technique that can also be, I wish I could show you right now, because that's exactly what they're doing when they decorate the pots at the Saturday Evening Girls Paul Revere Pottery. They're creating a valley and then filling in the field between the valley, except with them it's glazed and not with a watered down clay called a slip. William Morris tiles, I'm trying to think, arts and crafts. He evolved into using glaze in the tiles instead, but still framing the pattern with an impression, and then filling the field in with the glaze to make those patterns. But it's the same Roman technique that went back a long time.
But how did they turn it over? That's what I'm.
Oh, how did they turn it over? They would wait until the gloss has gone on the slip. The problem is with that, too, plus I have seen dish rack type shelves, if you want, where they have slats. So at least some air circulation is happening underneath. I've seen those as well. in the 1880s and 90s, and I would guess that they would be either that or they were putting it on extremely coarse sand, which is, I think, the way they did it in the Roman period. Maybe that's how it was done.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. So the any other questions? Combination of the three techniques eventually come together. One of the products that was made at Saturday Evening Girls Pottery would be requiring a coil that's pulled. So this is called a pulled handle. We also had extruders or Play-Doh factories or something like a sausage maker. So that can go like this. We centered this now. We'll bring it up. And what could be... See, the thing is generally when you learn how to throw, you're taught one lump of clay, one pot, that's what you got. Well, this is going to be utilizing the one lump of clay and producing a number of pots from it. Also, the other exception to it too, especially when I was taught back in high school, was you always have one hand inside, you got one hand outside. And then you find out that your hands won't work for you. Because your fingers are just too chubby. So you use a poo-poo platter stick. There we go. Or a shish kebab skewer. And work the opening that way, and that goes that way. And we bring this down this way. Do you have any questions? Probably was something, it's intriguing to everybody who watches pottery, but the young girls who watched Edith, hopefully recognized that a sense of humor with everything you do is important. Don't take yourself so seriously. Obviously, I don't think the two Ediths, they were committed. I'm sure they confronted a lot of stressful situations off and on, trying to keep things going with the pottery. But having a sense of humor allows you to do that. So you see the clay wobble, and it's going to dance around, and it's going to intimidate you, and you're going to think you're losing control, and it's going one way. If it's going one way, then what you do is you teach yourself, go with it, find out how you made it. If it's not what you're making, at least learn from that. Take the instruction when the opportunity comes, in other words. No big deal. And then it wobbles, so you notice you got to cut that off. That there's a solution. Need a little more speed. It's also a question of taking what's familiar and working with it and creating something new. Scrape the water off, get this sticky again. There we go. No. Let's see, first things first. All right. There we go. So you got that. Once you got that, so by right there should be holes there, but I already told you that the clay is flexible, so it would have to stiffen up so it's like a piece of Swiss cheese, but not as stiff as a piece of sole leather. And then I can poke the holes in it and not worry about changing the shape too much. There. Goes like this. So basically it's two bottles, one's closed in and the other one's made into a little spout like that. So this is very close to looking like with their teapot. That's not as, any questions?
No.
None. So that's not as complicated as they do get. So you can take a lump of clay and you can make one pot from it. You can take a lump of clay, make many pieces from it, and put them together. There. Should be about big enough. Maybe a little too big. Take that off. We'll do another handle. Now, although I showed the glaze container I have there on the table, the glazes that were available to them could have been just as easily found in a container. Those old magazines I have there from the 1920s show that you can buy glazes, or you could make your own. The similarity with the clay and the glaze is that they're both different forms of a glass-like material. The silica is the one that's going to melt into your glass coating. I like to call that the skin, especially for the glaze. Because it's powdered rock, and there's a lot of different types of powdered clays because there are a lot of different rocks and a lot of different ways the rock was formed into a powder. So there are different types of clays, and whether it's a clay or whether it's a powdered granite, a feldspar, or a syenite. Next to the sand, the silica, or if you want to call it the skin, is going to be the bones. That's going to be alumina, and the alumina, as it increases in quantity, is going to stiffen the glass melt. And then you got the fluxes that Mother Nature put into the clay, or you're going to mix in with your glaze. So if you want to make a glaze for your pottery, you need to make sure that it melts before your pots melt. Because remember, I showed you this earlier, and this is a 9-inch bowl that melted in my kiln. It was a brand new kiln. I thought I was going to trust the kiln. I didn't. I did until I realized that the pots were melting in there. And then I shut the kiln off because I could judge the temperature by the heat color. So the clay is going to be in the kiln, and it's going to be brought up to 1900 degrees, and it's going to retain its shape. But the glaze itself has got to melt into a clear glass liquid on the pots. So you got to flux it higher. You got to put more flux and less bones in it. More blood, in other words, to make the glass melt, make it flow. So that's going to be sodium or potassium or calcium or all these different materials that we happen to have either in one form isolated by itself, or in a powdered rock that we can obtain locally, or we make it happen by adding something that wasn't in the rock. So these glazes that they were using lead, probably to melt the material down into a glass coating. But the lead in the sand by itself would melt on the pots and then glue everything together because it'd be excessively fluid. So to the skin and the flux, the blood, you'd add your bones, so you add clay, the same clay you're throwing with. And that would make your glaze. So the glaze would melt on the pots into a nice shiny surface, unless you underfire it, and you'll look over there and you'll see some of them have a matte glaze on them. And there's two ways to do that. You don't melt the glaze enough, so it remains in a partial state of melting, or you add something to it that's going to cause it to crystallize on the surface. Lithium does that, makes a matte glaze. Actually, that should go like this. There we go. Bring that like that. I left that a little too tall, so I'm going to cut that off. To add color to the glaze is just using powdered metals. So some of those real nice greens are from copper, the blues are from a metal called cobalt. Tin would give a white. Antimony would give a yellow. 1940s uranium was giving us yellow. As well as orange. And underneath here, over here. So that looks something like that over here. An idea of how it's done. So that's a pot where the clay looks like it was made out of two pieces and put together, as opposed to this guy, which was made out of three pieces, and then a fourth was cut out. So that's what's fun about it. There's no there's no reason to stay with one opinion on how pottery is made. Just like with Saturday Night Evening Girls, there was no reason to have an opinion that change wasn't possible, or positive change wasn't possible for the girls. Just because they were from the north end of Boston and they were living in slums. It was the belief that change, actually it was the belief that life is motion, and with motion and pressure, you can get into some good transitions in life and form something that isn't supposed to be done, that isn't supposed to be made. Do another candlestick now. That's what's fun about it. That's what's fun about pottery making, and that's what's fun about researching the history about pottery making, especially these two ladies. The hardest thing is to get centered and to get going on it. And then learning the rules and then breaking the rules, because that's what this is all about. They can teach you one particular way, and then you'll find somebody online who's doing it completely differently. Just wanted to show you how, this isn't one of theirs, but I just wanted to give you an impression on how even a tool scrapped from a piece of molding, OG molding. Whoop. Now that wasn't supposed to happen. I cut right through. My wall was thin. I'll just bring it up, which actually now looks like the original, oddly enough. Get that off. Put that back. We'll do that one again. I wanted to show how a profile can be put into the clay. So sometimes you can move on past using just your hands. And something that isn't even related to the potter's trade actually is being utilized by the potters. There we go. It's being open-minded, it's being creative. Confident enough to try it, and if it doesn't work out, you're not taking it any more than what it is. A learning experience. There we go. So that's a simple candlestick that I wasn't going for. So let's do the other one again. Any questions? No questions. Okay. I wanted to show how that OG molding shapes the clay too. That's the thing about this. You don't necessarily have to trust your hands all the time. You can impress. Let's try this again by using some simple tools. Now, here we go again. If you want to call that simple or complicated, but it certainly is approachable, and that's what the point is. And everything that was in, especially Edith's world was complicated. She seemed to have simplified it. There was Longfellow was a poet at the end of the 19th century, and he basically was in the Cambridge area for a good part of his life. And he wrote this poem that she certainly probably was familiar with. It's called Keramos. It's about potters. And one of the things that he said in this poem, which goes on for pages and pages and pages, was turn, and this is probably something that inspired her. I can't see her not knowing this because of the fact that her grandfather was in correspondence with Whittier and Thoreau and Alcott and all these thinkers. Turn my wheel, the human race of every tongue, of every place, Caucasian, Coptic, or Malay, all that inhabit this great earth, whatever be their rank or worth, are kindred and allied by birth, and made of the same clay. Turn my wheel, what is done at daybreak must at dark be done. Tomorrow will be another day. Tomorrow, the hot furnace flame will search the heart and try the frame, and stamp with honor or with shame these vessels made of clay. Had to be something she read. Had to be something that impressed her. When she was forced to retire from Paul Revere pottery, Hoover contacted her, brought her into a program in Washington, D.C. They needed to find a way to evaluate food quality. So she started a department that would eventually become the FDA. What would be amazing is to pick this up. This is one of those. There's a metal, two metal horseshoes that they have arcs in them. You slide them underneath. You pick them up. The word clay, by the way, means sticky. It was spelled G-L-E-I, and it is the root word for gluten, as well as for clot. There. So now you can see how bad it is. So now that it's playing with me, I'm going to not panic because I just need the right tool to lift it up on the edge. Here we go. There's always a way. You get nervous, you think you're not going to do it, but there we go. Now let's see, any questions?
When you're making a candlestick, and you're varying the diameter for the candle, do you have to make it longer or taller if it's a wider candle? I mean, as far as
For one,
the...
I don't even know the consistency in candle size anymore. I mean, you can find tapers that have a base on them that flare differently. Some candles are just blunt end. It's very difficult, to be honest with you, to match every candle.
But would the weight be significant? The weight of the candle, would that affect the size of the candlestick or the way it's made?
Well, I wouldn't put a pillar on this.
No. I don't think I would either.
But not that I'm aware of. Not that I'm aware of.
So if you wanted to make that twice as high, you would just put more ridges on it, right?
Yeah.
How high could, I mean, if you were just doing it by hand without the tools, how tall do you think you could do it? Keeping that same diameter?
Oh, that's just a solid chunk of clay there. I think it'd start whipping around this height.
Yeah.
The only way to answer that is probably by trying it. Yeah. The other thing, though, is that because of the water in the clay to make this plastic, when that evaporates, it's going to cause the clay to shrink. So for every quarter-inch, the clay is going to shrink a quarter-inch, 12%, for every 2 inches. So you got to figure that way, which you can go by that rule, but the shrinkage sometimes is different on the height than it is on the diameter, because you're doing a bowl and the stupid thing is cupping in, the rim is narrowing up. There's a great video online showing this flat plate that this guy threw, and it's just curling up on time lapse. It's frustrating. Yes.
And now, if you were just to leave it to air dry, would it get hard at all? It wouldn't. It wouldn't harden at all.
Technically, I'm shaking clay.
Okay.
This would be called greenware. I forgot to mention that. And as greenware, it can be returned back to the clay state.
Oh.
Now, the American Indians, in constructing their pots for cooking and for food storage, had the necessity of having to fire the pots quickly, but also having a pot that they could cook in that would expand and contract, hopefully several times without failing. So when you add a coarse material to the clay, what you're actually doing is putting a little wall in there that's going to lead to a crack. So the cracks don't continue. You know what I'm saying? You're actually forcing little cracks in the clay as you add sand.
Right.
But the sand stops the crack from continuing on.
Right.
So the American Indians were adding crushed shell or maybe gravel, and they were only heating the pots sufficiently on embers to cause the pots to go into a state that's called sintered. For them to enter a ceramic state, the silica's got to start to melt. We are not entering that point at that low heat. We're into a super dehydrated state that will not return back to a soft clay if it's wet, or it won't even turn into a material that's even going to be any kind of soft material. It has changed form so it can hold liquids and be cooked in. So that's called sintered pottery or pit-fired pottery. Once you put a covering on the fire and put more fire into it, whether it looks like a beehive or a bottle or it looks like a sleeping whale, these kilns would have the heat coming in, and from the nose of the whale going to a narrow opening in the back, flame would just shoot right through, and you can go all the way up to white heat as long as the kiln takes the heat. In other words, you're doing stoneware, you don't make it out of red clay brick, because you're going to be crying the next morning. And brick drips all over the pots. Any other questions? Sounded like one was coming.
Yeah, I'm not sure that I know how to ask the question. I have a piece of Dev, you know, yeah, and it's a face in a candlestick,
Yeah.
but part of the cheek has blown out because there was air or something in the thing that was being fired. But now that stuff breaks very easily. Is that?
That's why generally, well, that's the to answer the question simply, it's because it's low fired and it's very soft and it's a sandy clay. Delftware was very sandy. We call it an earthenware because of the soft nature of it. And that's probably a buff Delftware, sort of a tan clay color, not
blue,
a red.
It's blue. It's
No, the clay body itself.
well, yeah, white, gray.
Yeah. And so there's white, in the low fire range, you have the same colors of clays as you do in the high temperature generally. But it's just that there's more bones, there's more alumina in the clay as you go up, and less flux to cause that glass to melt. So you can take Delftware clay, sometimes that was made out of a stoneware clay, and they could have been fired up to what's called a pipe clay. The English will call it a pipe clay. This would be a pipe clay, because tobacco pipes, this long, the church wardens were being made out of it. We call it kaolin nowadays. And from the Chinese word meaning clay hill, because that's where they found the clay was on a hill, not in a flat area. And the white clay, depending on how it's balanced, can be fired just hard enough, like yours, or it can be fired all the way up so it's translucent, like a piece of porcelain.
But why did the piece blow out in the cheek?
Well, I'd have to see that. It could be, if they were using plaster, for instance, or I was buying my clay, another way to put it, I was buying my clay from a source in Western Mass that unfortunately was including some small pieces of a marble or a calcium-bearing stone. And in the heat of my kiln, what would happen was I was changing that into plaster. Plaster is naturally thirsty, likes to grab the water out of the air. And suddenly my wife and I were making pots, and sometimes coming out of the kiln, we'd have a blowout just like that because the plaster formed, and when it was cooling, it swelled up from the moisture it was absorbing, and it blew the wall out. So we were losing pots. Sometimes it happens a year or two after a customer buys it, which isn't a good thing. Because you don't know that when you hear it. It could happen 10 years later. There's an artist potter who did exactly that, put loads of plaster into his clay, and he sold you the pot so you could watch them deteriorate over time. Seriously, yeah, it's an apple.
Planned obsolescence?
Well, yeah,
Like the auto industry.
exactly. Most things. It could be that it was next to the fire in the kiln. And as the heat was just licking that particular portion, where the face was, there wasn't sufficiently dry and the water got excited and blew the face right off. Usually that's done with a mold, and then it's of the face, and then it's applied. And that's called clobbering. That's the old slang for it. That was a clobbered Delftware you have. So,
Thank you.
interesting thing. We call it, nowadays they call it sprigging, but I think it's called clobbering. Any other questions? If you want, what I can do is I will open up a pot, and I'll put my towel over here, and I'll invite you to come up and touch the pot as it's rotating. I'm going to scrape the water off, so when you go to touch it, your hand's going to be grabbed by the clay and your arm's going to go out of socket. But that's only for a second, because then I'll wet the clay and it'll be slippery and it'll pop. But if you've never felt clay before on the wheel, don't go crazy on me and grab the pot and suddenly start to... I've had those people do that, but I certainly want to give you the opportunity to find out why I'm putting water on the clay, and at least some of the flexibility of of what I'm shaping on the wheel. And I'll put the towel over there so you can wipe your fingers off. You're just doing it with your fingertips, unless you're one of those that grabs the clay, which I've met on occasion. Do that here. We'll bring this up. So that's a different pull I just did right now. You're taught one method, and that method differs from every instructor. And then you're taught that you can't do one thing, you can't do the other thing. Well, the way it works out is, look on YouTube and everybody's breaking the rules. People around the world have been shaping pottery for thousands of years, and they push the clay. They spin the clay differently, they palm throw, they dry throw, they wet throw. There were 3 South Korean potters standing in a triangle throwing a hot tub or a big bowl or something from the corner to that chair in diameter on YouTube.
Really?
You say you can't do it, you won't do it.
How did you get into pottery?
I was fortunate we had it up at Tantasco in Sturbridge, that's the high school I went to. And I really stunk at it. But I stayed with it for 3 years, and I fell in love with it. And my mother suggested I go try it, explore it at Old Sturbridge Village to see if it was something that could be done as a career. So I worked there for 10 years, fell in love with the local history, because I'm a Southbridge, I was born in Hamilton. In a sense, I'm a Southbridge native, but I grew up in Sturbridge. And even at Tantasco, we were never taught that the industry was local all over. It wasn't Charlton, it wasn't Brimfield, it wasn't in Sturbridge, because it's a big sand pit. It was in the Brookfields. We just have this rich history, and I didn't know about it. So I fell in love with the history, started researching it, coming across stories like the 2 Ediths, or other folks like Grace Parker, and been able to do it now. It's my 43rd year in pottery. I have a couple hiccups with the career, just like they did too. Financial calamities, financial markets, stress in the market, too many stupid things on the market for people to buy, so the competition is all over. Shipping cost, increasing your product cost, which is what screwed them up. Big manufacturers selling cheap products, glassware. It's a career that can be done, and there are potters that are rock stars making more money than you can ever imagine, that tour the world. And there's local talent that's doing amazing work, selling nationally or internationally. There's local talent that just enjoys, just playing and doing it for themselves. But it can be done on a lot of different levels. But it's just a matter of getting started. I earn my livelihood by doing this, as well as doing research, doing the programs, and selling pots. Wow. And the internet's changed a lot of that for us. But at this point, everybody's a little nervous out there too, so we're affected by the market as well.
So do you have an open studio at certain times of the year?
First weekend in October, but we're open by appointment.
And it's in?
Warren, Mass. Yep, thanks. We're just 12 miles away. So any other questions?
How much does an average pot about that size cost?
For me?
For you?
That's roughly, I generally start around $30. Some go down, I make inkwells for storage in Village. They're about $10 a piece in the gift shop. And then we go up a lot higher than that. Depends on the amount of time my wife and I put into it. She's a decorator. She does what's called sgraffito. And she does very elaborate decorations, along the lines of what you see there. Sometimes original work, sometimes not. So, and then you got the cost of the materials and the electricity and everything else that goes into it. But there are potters that sell pots for tens of thousands of dollars as well. Like I said, it's very, you can make, there's parallels with the music industry with this. There's one-hit wonders, and there are guys that do it their whole lives, and they recognize, and they're in the museums, but, they get a hit occasionally, is what the way it works. I'm in museums, I've won awards, but I'm one of the quiet guys.
The unsung heroes.
No one's asked me to come out yet to another country. So if you want to feel this, I invite you to come up. If you don't, I want to thank you for coming. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have another question.
The Cultural Council.
What about it? Oh, thank you to the Cultural Council for hosting this event, funding this event at this library. I appreciate it. This is the second time they funded, and it's probably, oh God, I know I've received over a dozen grants from the Southbridge Cultural Council through the years for doing programs in Southbridge, back in the day when Mary Wells, that was back in the 80s and 90s. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.